The palace of the Alpha King had one rule everyone obeyed: never go near the nursery alone. Tonight, the halls were filled with screaming. Furniture cracked against stone. Guards stood outside a heavy door, weapons drawn but useless. No one was allowed to hurt the king's only son. Inside, a boy no older than 10 was tearing the room apart. He was not just a boy. He was a wolf child, and tonight, something inside him was breaking loose. This was the 11th maid assigned to him this season. She was already gone, sobbing, refusing to return. The guards had seen this before. They would see it again, until they saw her. A young woman walked down the corridor alone, carrying an empty tray she'd forgotten to put down. She wasn't a noble. She wasn't trained for this. She was Mira, new, quiet, human, the kind of servant no one bothered to remember by name. Don't, a guard warned. It's not safe. Mira didn't stop. She heard the crying beneath the screaming. Everyone else heard a monster. She heard a child. She pushed the door open. The room was in ruins, shattered toys, claw marks dragged deep into the floor. The pup turned to her, snarling, ready to be feared again, because fear was the only thing anyone had ever given him. Mira didn't run. She lowered herself to the floor, right in front of him, close enough that one snap of his jaw could end everything. And then, softly, she began to hum. The pup froze mid-snarl. Outside the door, the guards stopped breathing. No one moved. The palace of the Alpha King had many rules, but every servant knew the one rule that mattered most: never go near the nursery alone. That night, the halls were filled with screaming. Furniture cracked against stone walls. Guards stood outside a heavy wooden door, weapons drawn but useless, because no one was allowed to hurt the king's only son. Inside, a boy no older than 10 was tearing the room apart. But he was not just a boy. He was a wolf child, and tonight, something inside him was breaking loose. This was the 11th maid assigned to him this season. She was already gone, sobbing, her uniform torn, refusing to ever return. The guards exchanged tired looks. They had seen this before. They would see it again, until they saw her. A young woman walked down the corridor, alone, carrying nothing but an empty tray she had forgotten to put down. She wasn't a noble. She wasn't even trained for this. She was simply Mira, new, quiet, human, the kind of servant no one in the palace bothered to remember by name. Don't, a guard warned her. Wait for the healer. It's not safe. But Mira didn't stop walking. She had heard the crying beneath the screaming. Everyone else heard a monster. She heard a child. She pushed the door open. The room was in ruins, shattered toys, a broken chair, claw marks dragged deep into the wooden floor. In the middle of it all stood the pup, chest heaving, eyes glowing gold with a rage that wasn't really rage at all. It was grief with nowhere to go. He turned to her, snarling, ready to be feared again, because fear was the only thing anyone had ever given him. Mira didn't run. She didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't call for help. Instead, slowly, she lowered herself to the floor, right in front of him, close enough that one snap of his jaw could end everything. And then, softly, almost like a secret only the two of them were allowed to hear, she began to hum. It was an old lullaby. Nothing special. The kind mother's hum to frighten children in villages far from palace walls. The kind Mira herself hadn't heard sung to her in years, not since she was small enough to believe someone would always keep her safe. The pup froze mid-snarl. His ears, which had been pinned back in fury, slowly turned toward the sound. Outside the door, the guards stopped breathing. No one moved. No one dared break whatever was happening inside that room. Word travels fast in a palace built on fear. By the time the sun rose, the story had already changed shape 3 times in the mouths of the staff. Some said the new maid used forbidden magic. Some said she was simply too foolish to know. She should have been afraid. But the guards who stood outside that door knew the truth was much simpler and much stranger. She sang, and the monster went still. Far from a nursery, in a cold private chamber at the top of the palace, the Alpha King sat alone, exactly as he did most nights. He had stopped visiting his son's room months ago, not because he didn't love him, but because he loved him too much to watch him suffer and be unable to help. The king had buried his mate 2 winters ago. He had told himself that grief fades. He had told himself his son would heal on his own, the way wolves were supposed to heal, through strength, through time, through silence. He was wrong, and some quiet part of him had always known it. That night, for the first time in weeks, the screaming from the nursery stopped early. No shattering wood. No guards rushing to report another failed maid. Just silence. The king rose from his chair before he even realized he was moving. He walked the long corridor to the nursery himself, something he hadn't done in a long time, his heart doing something strange and unfamiliar, hoping, though he refused to call it that. He opened the door, and there, in the middle of the wreckage, sat a human maid on the cold floor, her uniform dusted with splinters, humming quietly with her back straight and her hands calm in her lap. His son, his fierce, wild, grieving son, was curled beside her, head resting against her arm, finally asleep. The king said nothing. He simply stood in the doorway, unnoticed, and watched. For the first time since his mate had died, he felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. It wasn't relief. It wasn't even hope. It was something closer to being seen, as if this stranger sitting on his nursery floor had somehow reached a place in his household that he, the Alpha King himself, had never been able to reach. He didn't understand why, but he knew, standing there, that he did not want her to leave. Mira didn't notice him at first. She was too focused on the boy's slow, even breathing, too careful not to move and wake him. When she finally looked up and found the king watching her from the doorway, she froze. Not from fear of the pup this time, but from the sudden, dizzying realization of exactly who was looking at her, and how. He wasn't looking at her like a servant. He was looking at her like someone he needed to understand. "You should be afraid of him," the king said quietly, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "He's not the one I'm afraid of," Mira answered, before she could stop herself. The king's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to curiosity. No one spoke to him so plainly. No one dared. "Then what are you afraid of?" he asked. Mira hesitated. The pup shifted slightly against her arm, and she lowered her voice again, protective, gentle, being sent away before he learns he's allowed to trust someone. The king said nothing for a long moment. Something about the way she said it, steady, certain, without a trace of flattery or fear, settled into him in a way he wasn't prepared for. He stepped fully into the room for the first time in months. But peace in a palace never lasts long. Before the king could speak again, urgent footsteps echoed down the hall. An advisor burst through the doorway, breathless, his face pale with something far worse than fear of the pup's temper. "My king," he said, struggling to catch his breath. "The healers need to see him immediately." What just happened tonight? It wasn't just grief. The king's expression hardened instantly, the fragile warmth from moments ago replaced by cold alarm. "What do you mean?" The advisor's eyes flicked, just once, toward Mira and the sleeping pup curled peacefully in her arms, a peace no one else had ever managed to give him. "His body," the advisor said quietly, "is trying to do something none of us can stop. And if we don't understand it soon, it might kill him." The king turned back to his son, asleep for the first time in weeks because a maid he had never even properly met, and felt the ground shift beneath him all over again. Whatever the stranger had started, there was no going back now. The healers worked through the night, and by morning, the king had a diagnosis he did not want to hear. His son wasn't simply grieving. He was dying slowly from the inside. The healers called it a suppressed shift, a condition so rare most wolves only knew it from old stories. Somewhere in his sorrow, the pup's inner wolf had locked itself away, refusing to surface. But a wolf cannot stay human forever. The longer it stayed buried, the more it clawed at him from within, poisoning his body with a war he had no way of winning alone. "There's only one reason he hasn't already lost that fight," the head healer said quietly, glancing toward the door. "Something, or someone, is keeping him calm enough to survive it." The king didn't need to ask who. He found Mira in the small servants' courtyard the next morning, sleeves rolled up, hanging laundry like it was any other day, as though she hadn't spent the night with his dying son's head resting against her arm. "You're not afraid of him," the king said, stepping into the courtyard without announcing himself, the way only someone used to command could. "Everyone else is. Why aren't you?" Mira didn't stop working. "Because he's not dangerous. He's drowning. There's a difference." The king studied her for a long moment. In the daylight, she looked even less like what he expected. No noble grace, no practiced charm, nothing performed for his benefit. Just tired eyes and steady hands. And yet he found himself unable to look away. "I need you to stay with him," he said. "Not as a maid. As whatever it is you're doing that no one else can." For the first time, Mira looked directly at him. Really looked, not the careful, downward glance servants were trained to give kings. "And if I say no?" The king hadn't expected the question. No one had ever dared ask him that. "Then I suppose," he said slowly, something almost like a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, "I'll have to convince you." It wasn't an order. It was, strangely, something closer to a request, and both of them seemed to notice it at the same time, a small and dangerous shift neither was ready to name. Word of the king's decision spread through the palace like wildfire. A human, given a position of trust over the heir to the throne. Nobles who had spent years circling the motherless pup like patient wolves, some hoping to marry him off young to secure influence, others hoping he'd simply fade away so a stronger heir could rise, did not take the news kindly. "She's using something unnatural on him," one noblewoman whispered in the East Hall, loud enough to be overheard on purpose. "No ordinary human calms a wolf like that. Not without a price." "Perhaps the price," another added with a thin smile, "is the king's own judgment." Mira heard none of it. She was too busy learning the small, quiet language of a boy no one had bothered to learn before her. The way he tugged twice at her sleeve before a bad episode hit. The way he only ate if she sat beside him first. The way, slowly, achingly slowly, he began to reach for her hand before she even offered it. She didn't know she was becoming dangerous to people far more powerful than her. She only knew that for the first time in his life, the pup was starting to trust someone completely. The king told himself he only checked on his son each evening out of duty. He told himself the same thing every time he found an excuse to linger in the doorway a little longer than necessary. Watching Mira braid wildflowers into his son's fur just to make him laugh, or listening to her hum that same worn lullaby until the pup's restless whimpering finally settled into sleep. He told himself a great many things. None of them were true. One evening, he stayed long enough that Mira finally noticed him standing there, arms crossed, doing a poor job of pretending he'd simply been passing by. "You do this every night," she said, not quite a question. "I check on my son every night," the king corrected, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "You check on him," Mira said, tilting her head slightly, something quietly amused in her eyes, from the doorway. "Where he can't see you. Where I can't see you either, if I wasn't paying attention." The king said nothing for a moment, caught in a rare, unfamiliar position, the powerful alpha king, out of words in front of a maid. "Perhaps," he finally admitted, "I don't yet know how to be close to him without it hurting. Watching from a distance is easier." Something in Myra's expression softened, the teasing gone, replaced by something gentler. "It's not easier for him," she said quietly. "He waits for you. Every night. He just never says so." The king looked past her, to where his son slept curled against her side, and for the first time in a long while, the distance he'd built to protect himself from more loss felt less like protection and more like punishment for both of them. He didn't step closer that night, but something in him had already started moving toward the door. The noble's patience ran out before the king's courage caught up. A grand court gathering was announced. A formal evening meant to reassure the kingdom that the young heir was recovering, that all was well, that the whispers of scandal surrounding a human maid's sudden influence were nothing to fear. Mira was told, quietly and firmly, that her presence would not be required that evening. A minor scheduling matter, she was told. Nothing more. She didn't think much of it. She trusted the palace staff to know what they were doing. She should not have. The great hall was filled with nobles in their finest, polite conversation humming beneath golden light, when the first scream cut through the music. The pup, surrounded by strangers, no familiar hand to hold, no soft voice humming beside him, convulsed violently in the center of the floor, his body twisting between forms as though something inside him had finally lost the war it had been fighting for weeks. The healers rushed forward, but it was already worse than anything they'd seen before. "Find her!" The king's voice cracked through the chaos, raw with a fear he no longer bothered to hide. "Find her now!" But by the time servants finally located Mira, locked out, deliberately delayed by confusion, over her schedule that was no accident at all, and she came sprinting through the grand hall doors, her breath tearing from her chest, the healers had already stepped back, helpless. "There's nothing more we can do," the head healer said quietly, refusing to meet the king's eyes. "Whatever happens next, he has to survive it himself." Mira dropped to her knees beside the shaking, convulsing pup in front of the entire watching court, the king's desperate eyes locking onto hers as if she were the only steady thing left in the room. And for the first time since she'd walked into that ruined nursery, Mira didn't know if a song would be enough to save him. The great hall had gone silent in the way only true fear can silence a room. Nobles who moments ago had been sipping wine and trading careful smiles now stood frozen along the walls, watching a child convulse on the marble floor, his body caught in a war between two forms it could not decide between. The healers had already stepped back. There was nothing left in their hands to give. Mira knelt beside him anyway. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the healers who had given up, or the nobles whispering behind their fans, already shaping tonight into a story about the human girl who failed when it mattered most. She looked only at the pup, at the boy who tugged twice at her sleeve before every storm, who had learned, slowly, that her hand meant safety. "I'm here," she whispered, taking a shaking hand in both of hers. "I'm not leaving. I'm right here." She began to sing, not the quiet hum she used in empty nurseries, safe from watching eyes. This time her voice rose, clear and unshaken, filling the great hall the way it had once filled a wrecked and broken room meant for no one else to hear. The court, for the first time in the kingdom's memory, fell utterly silent for a servant. The king stood frozen at the edge of the chaos, every instinct in him screaming to act, to command, to fix something, and finding, for the first time in his life, that there was nothing his crown could do. So he did the only thing left. He knelt down beside them, on the cold marble floor, in front of every noble in his kingdom, and took his son's other hand. "Stay with us," he said, voice breaking in a way kings were never supposed to allow. "Please." Mira glanced at him, just once, just long enough for something unspoken to pass between them, something steadier than fear. Then she kept singing, and he kept holding on, and for a moment, nothing else in the world existed except the three of them and the fragile thread keeping the pup tethered to life. No one in the hall understood why that particular song mattered. No one but the king. He hadn't heard it in 2 winters. Not since the nights his mate used to sing their son to sleep, her voice soft against the dark, a lullaby she'd learned from her own mother, passed down through a bloodline that ended the night she died. He had never told anyone the words. He had never taught them to a soul. And yet here was a human maid, a stranger from a village he'd never even asked the name of, singing his dead mate's lullaby word for word, as if she had somehow reached backward through grief itself and found the one sound that could still call his son home. It wasn't magic. It wasn't fate written in the stars. It was smaller than that, and somehow far more astonishing. An old song passed quietly between mothers and villages far from palace walls, carried across bloodlines and borders by nothing but love, until it found its way, against every impossible odd, into the mouth of the one person who could save his son with it. The king would spend the rest of his life wondering how the universe had arranged such a thing. In that moment, he simply held on and let it happen. Something shifted. The pup's convulsions slowed. His breathing, which had been tearing in ragged gasps, began to even out, matching the rhythm of Myra's voice like a drowning thing finally finding the surface. The golden light around him didn't burst violently outward this time. It settled, like a held breath finally released. And then, gently, without the screaming and shattering wood of every episode before, the boy shifted, first spread smoothly across his small frame. Claws replaced fingers without a single cry of pain. For the first time since the night his mother died, the pup completed the change not through violence, but through peace, guided, not forced by the one voice that had never once asked him to be anything other than exactly what he was. He collapsed, exhausted, into his true wolf form, and instead of curling away from everyone the way he always had, he curled directly around Mira, his small head resting against her knee, finally, fully unafraid. The hall let out a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. The king rose slowly, one hand still resting on his sleeping son's fur, his eyes finding Myra's across the small space between them. "You knew that song," he said quietly, disbelief and something far gentler tangled together in his voice. "I didn't know what it meant," Mira admitted, still catching her breath, her hand never leaving the pup's side. "I only knew it was the kind of song you sing to someone you're afraid of losing." The king looked at her for a long moment, really looked the way he had that very first night in the ruined nursery, except now there was no distance left between them, no doorway to hide behind, no excuse of duty to explain why he couldn't look away. "Then I suppose," he said softly, "you've been singing it to the right person all along." Myra's breath caught. Around them, the entire court stood watching, but for the first time since she'd walked through those palace gates, she found she didn't care who was looking. The days that followed unraveled quickly for the nobles who had arranged her absence. The king, no longer the distant and untouchable ruler he'd forced himself to be, moved through his own court with a sharpness no one expected. Servants who had confused Myra's schedule that night were questioned. A trail of quiet arrangements, deliberate delays, and whispered bribes led back to exactly the noble woman who had once called Myra's bond with the pup unnatural. The king dealt with the matter decisively, without spectacle, without cruelty, simply removing, one by one, every hand that had reached for his son's suffering as an opportunity. No declarations were made about Myra's place in the palace. None needed to be. The proof had already knelt on that marble floor in front of the entire court, and every noble who had once doubted her now understood exactly what would happen to anyone foolish enough to threaten her again. Months later, sunlight spilled softly through the nursery windows, no longer a room of shattered toys and clawed floors, but a warm, quiet space filled with color and laughter. The pup, steady now, curious and gentle in ways no one had believed possible, dozed in a sunlit corner, one paw twitching in some peaceful dream. Mira sat nearby, mending a small torn shirt, humming that same worn lullaby, without even realizing she was doing it anymore. It had simply become part of her, the way breathing was. In the doorway, unnoticed, the king stood watching. Not from duty this time, not from distance, but simply because he could not imagine being anywhere else. He no longer waited for an excuse to linger. He crossed the room, sat down on the floor beside her, the Alpha King on the nursery floor, exactly where the humblest maid in his palace had once sat when no one else dared to, and for once said nothing at all. He didn't need to. Some silences, he had learned, said more than any crown ever could.